and forbidding desert of southern Iraq. It's a place of sudden and violent sandstorms. But today, we'll see it torn apart by a different kind of storm.
We engage them with tank main gun rounds. You see the explosions going off.
I dropped down inside. I looked through my commander's sight. I was vitally impressed with the enemy.
The U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry is on a collision course with the Tawakalna Division of Iraq's Republican Guard.
They see themselves being great warriors who are expected to stand and fight and even die so that others may live.
Two tank armies clash on a remote strip of desert. This is the Battle of 73 Easting, armored warfare at its most intense.
This probably was the last great tank battle of the 20th century.
February 24th, 1991. American tanks roll across the Saudi Arabian desert toward the Iraq border. They're part of a multinational force with a clear and simple mission: to drive Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army out of Kuwait.
Coming out of the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam has two problems. He has a great big military with nothing really for it to do. The other problem he has is that he has devastated Iraq's economy as a result of the Iran-Iraq War. And so when you're Saddam Hussein and you need money, when you need it, you do what comes natural. You rob the piggy bank next door. And in this case, that piggy bank was Kuwait.
Iraqi armor and infantry overrun the oil-rich emirate in just 36 hours. Saddam ignores the United Nations demand for an immediate withdrawal. And the UN sends an American-led coalition of 620,000 to show him they mean business.
Saddam realized that he was in a bit over his head. But in Saddam's mind, the great weakness of the United States was in their inability to take casualties. He assumed that it would be very much like the Iran-Iraq War. It would be a slugging fest between these two sides, and that in the end, the Americans would cry uncle first. And so the strategy that Saddam lays out is designed to cause the most casualties to the United States while absorbing the least damage to his own forces. He dug in the biggest share of the Iraqi army, 51 of 66 divisions, and he dug them in deep.
Saddam deploys 16 infantry divisions and 2 armored corps along the Saudi border to absorb the brunt of the coalition attack. He holds his best fighters in reserve. 8 divisions of the Republican Guard, 1,000 tanks and 120,000 men are poised to strike a massive counterattack and inflict devastating casualties on the advancing coalition.
The scheme for defending Kuwait that they actually employed was really the only one that was available to them. And the problem that they had was that the coalition wasn't going to play by their rules. They don't believe that it's possible for the coalition to move any further to the west. It is trackless desert out there. There were no terrain features, there were no roads. It was impossible to maneuver out there. And the one thing that the Iraqis weren't aware of was, at that time, a brand new technology called the Global Positioning System.
It's the first GPS war. Satellite technology enables the coalition to cross into Iraq far to the west of the main Iraqi defensive line, setting the stage for an attack on their unprotected right flank. At 1300 hours, the U.S. 7th Corps breaches the sand berm, marking the border between Iraq and Saudi Arabia.
We had a PSYOPs platoon with us with these 25,000-watt speakers on top of Humvees. They were there to broadcast surrender appeals, but I had them play Ride of the Valkyries as we were crossing over the berm into Iraq.
It's kind of cool watching it, but there was nothing there.
Our unit was moving to the north and to the east, and really not hitting a whole lot. I mean, yeah, we did. We had some reconnaissance units we ran into, but after a couple of shots at us, they would give up.
The armor of the 7th Corps rolls ever deeper into Iraq, but at a snail's pace. Cautious force commanders order continual halts.
And what they basically did was said, you know what, if we're going to go due east, we're just going to use the eastings, all the north-south grid lines, as our methods to control your rate of advance.
It was almost like we were crawling. It was not a fast lightning strike. It was very slow. Okay, we'd move a few clicks and they'd stop us.
I mean, a 50-ton vehicle, all this ammunition. I can drive 40-something, 50-something miles an hour, and you're telling me to stop? You know, the enemy's that way. I need to keep going.
There was no one forward to see anything, to make a personal evaluation. There were no Patton, Rommel, Guderian types who were pulling up next to my tank saying, well, there, Major, what do you think?
By the end of the second day, the initial surprise and strategic advantage of the flanking maneuver is lost. And the Iraqis realize that the U.S. 7th Corps is about to cut off and surround their forces in Kuwait.
It's at that moment that Iraq's general staff actually demonstrates some degree of real competence. They recognize what's going on, and what's more, they realize from the ease with which American formations have been destroying Iraqi formations throughout the theater, that if they are going to stop the American 7th Corps, they're not going to be able to throw some ash and trash, some weak formations in front of it and allow their better units to escape. Instead, they're going to have to put their best formations in front of those American divisions.
The Iraqis make their stand on a defensive line stretching 50 miles along the northwestern border of Kuwait. 2 infantry and 2 armored divisions of the Republican Guard will defend the northern half of the line. In the south and directly in the path of the advancing Americans are the cream of Saddam's armored forces.
And they saw themselves as Republican Guards as being the best of the best. Iraq's elite, professional warriors, not conscripts, who were expected to stand and fight and even die so that others may live.
We respected them. We knew that they were capable of some serious destruction, and we knew there were a lot of them. They got tons and tons of equipment. We respected that.
We were real worried about their armored vehicles. And of course, our biggest fear was the T-72 tank.
The Iraqi version of the T-72, known as the Lion of Babylon, is the backbone of the Iraqi Armored Corps. Its 5-inch main gun can destroy targets over 2,000 yards away. It's a 41-ton monster, plated with armor that is in places a foot thick. Still, it can reach a speed of 42 miles per hour. This makes the T-72 one of the fastest and most lethal heavy tanks in the world. And Saddam has more than 1,000 of them deployed along the Republican Guard's defensive line. They're supported by hundreds of armored vehicles, including the Soviet-designed BMP. The Republican Guard seems ready to take on all comers. Heading straight for them is the U.S.-led 7th Corps, with hundreds of M2 Bradley fighting vehicles and well over 1,000 tanks. The most powerful of these is the M1A1 Abrams main battle tank. The Abrams is armed with a 5-inch high-velocity cannon and protected by composite armor that's as tough as 24 inches of pure steel. It's 1.5 times heavier than the T-72, but just as fast, making it the most powerful tank on the battlefield. By the end of the day, on February 25th, these two armored forces are only 9 miles apart.
The morning of the 26th, very early, perhaps 4:30, 5 o'clock, I can't remember precisely, we suddenly get a change of orders and essentially find and destroy the Republican Guard for all intents and purposes. It got to the point, sort of late morning, early afternoon, where you couldn't see more than perhaps 20, 30 yards. All of a sudden, we're about to go into combat against the one real enemy that we had practiced to defeat, and suddenly our visibility is terrible.
But the Abrams is up to the job. It has a thermal imaging system that can identify the heat signatures of potential targets, even in the worst conditions.
So we're moving in this very limited visibility. And we begin to identify some hot spots.
As McMaster's platoon approaches 73 Easting, a line of longitude on the map, he encounters a Tawakalna Division forward outpost. It's manned by infantry with anti-tank guns and rocket-propelled grenades.
And it was at this point that we first received fire from the enemy. What we had to realize is we were paralleling a road that ran due east right into the enemy's position.
The Battle of 73 Easting, the last great tank battle of the 20th century, is about to begin. February 26, 1991. It's been 2 days since the U.S.-led international coalition invades southern Iraq in an attempt to outflank Iraqi forces and drive them out of nearby Kuwait. In response, the Iraqis establish a defensive screen, deploying 5 divisions of Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard, including the fully mechanized Tawakalna Division. Just west of the map reference 73 Easting, the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry, the spearhead of the coalition advance, makes contact with the Republican Guard.
And it was at this point we first received fire from the enemy. I then pull up our 9 tanks online, all of us oriented on this village. I give this troop fire command. Village, direct front, frontal, 1 round heat, at my command, ready report, which means everybody load a heat round, look at that village, pick out your aim points on the enemy positions, and when they're ready, we're gonna fire 9 simultaneous main gun rounds at the center. I fire 1 round before that to mark center with a tank heat round. Green says ready, white says ready. I say fire, 9 tank main gun rounds impact simultaneously. Now, we get the word, continue your move to the east. And it's at that point I just get this gut feeling, I get this feeling that we're about to make contact with a defending enemy force. And I make the decision to go into a tanks lead formation.
That means positioning the Abrams tanks in a rolling wedge, with the more vulnerable Bradley fighting vehicles tucked in behind for protection. This formation places McMaster's big guns forward, ready for whatever lies ahead.
So my tank comes up over that crest. And again, remember, it's a sandstorm, right? You can't see very far, but it is if the sandstorm just lifted. I mean, as soon as we came over that ridge, it was some weird environmental factor, but it was like a curtain lifted. And what I was confronted with was the enemy defensive position.
They were deployed in a reverse slope position, which is designed to minimize the amount of time and the amount of distance that an attacking force actually has before it can start to fire on the defenders. Unfortunately, they didn't count on the sophisticated optics and fire control systems of the U.S. M1 tanks, which made their thinking entirely obsolete.
I could see 8 enemy tanks in defensive positions, and I said, fire, fire, sabot, which means we had a heat round in, and it means the next round going in that gun is going to be a sabot tank, armor defeating round.
The Abrams tank carries 2 types of high-velocity ammunition. The sabot, an armor-piercing dart made with high-density depleted uranium, and the high-explosive anti-tank round, a shaped charge projectile which can bore through heavy armor.
We engaged that first tank with a heat round. That fireball blows the tank commander out of that tank. And then ultimately there's a secondary explosion that blows the turret off that tank. My gunner traverses left, hits another tank. We're able to destroy 3 tanks as our tank hits the first leading edge of the minefield.
I looked to the right, and I saw what looked like explosions to the left front of McMaster's tank. And I couldn't tell if these were mines or artillery fire again. And my gunner, Dewey Jones, pipes up and says, "Holy shit, look at this." And I dropped down inside. I looked through my commander's sight, and I said, "Oh yeah," I was finally impressed with the enemy. Here were, rows, literally 10, 15 tanks spread right across to the front, and you could see that these tank guns were moving. And I imagine, since these were manual T-72s, the poor Republican Guard was in there busily cranking to get the guns around towards us. Then all of a sudden, my tank went into a minefield. And this thing rocked this 70-ton tank. A fireball went over it, knocked me down to the turret floor. And fortunately, my driver, who was very tough-minded, said, "What the hell was that?" And I said, "Don't worry about it, keep driving." As we were coming out of the minefield, we had a couple of tanks to our front. It was, "Sir, I got tanks to my front." And I'm looking at the damn tank that we're about to take under fire, and the gunner hesitated. "Sir, can I shoot? Can I fire?" I said, "For God's sake, shoot!" We swung to the next one and fired. And in the meantime, I could see that Eagle Troop was taking enormous numbers of vehicles under fire.
Initially, there was a great deal of disorientation on the Iraqi side because they just assumed that this couldn't be American tanks attacking them. It had to be aircraft. But even after they figured it out, they still had difficulty getting into their vehicle in time because they didn't realize how quickly the Americans were closing on them. American armored forces would charge, using speed to simply try to disorient the Iraqis, and it worked. The Iraqis could not imagine armored forces this big, this powerful, moving at them as fast as they were.
It's a tactic developed by General Erwin Rommel, the great World War II German tank commander. And the M1A1 Abrams is ideally suited for this kind of warfare.
The gun stays right on target. It has a geostabilized system, and I mean, you can be moving out at 40, 50 kilometers an hour, going over bumps and firing. And then the shock effect of a 70-ton machine hurtling at you. I think this is the blow from which the enemy could never really recover. We were now on top of their command post, and we entered their reserve position. And just in like typical Soviet doctrine, they had put their tank reserve like a coil, but we moved too fast. They couldn't get out of their coil in time. They were just starting their engines. I looked at an enemy tank commander, looked over his shoulder at me. I could see the expression on his face, and we engaged that tank at very close range. And you couldn't tell the difference between the enemy tank being hit and our gun going off, and just big hunks of metal, blue sparks arced right back over our heads. And then the rest of our tanks came up, and we destroyed these tanks in their assembly area. Iraqis, had set up a pretty sound defense. I mean, it was a reverse slope defense. It had a reserve. It had a counterattack plan. It had a minefield to disrupt our movement. But the fatal flaw was that we gained surprise over them.
Despite the Iraqis' best efforts, Eagle Troop overwhelms the position, killing